On the internet, you can find services of mutual exchange. This has been around since the very beginning, in one form or another. An example of a site like this is Craigslist, and it's been around since the very epoch of this internet that we know of. But what happens when certain people decide to use something like this in order to perform unspeakable acts right out of a living nightmare? Welcome back to the Thetekkitrealm. Now today, of course, this is going to be another installment of a scary real-life story. For all sources on this story, for you to back up for yourself, will be linked in the description. Now, of course, we're going to be covering some very disturbing things, which also might be quite unsettling for some. So just be aware of that. Today we're talking about the story of Craigslist's worst serial killer. But before we get started into this story, if you'd like to submit your own scary story or experience to have it potentially turn into a video on this channel, you can go to the link below and check out thetekkitrealm.com. And also it'd be great if you can give out my brand new game called 2-Bit a Try. It's available on the App Store and Android, where you can simulate your own YouTube channel. And it's still a work in progress, but still kind of fun. I'd recommend it. Before the days of Amazon, one-day express delivery, TikTok, and even Facebook, it was a far more simple time. The time of HTML and basic JavaScript web pages, which really didn't have too much detail to them. Craigslist, of course, being one of the main central hubs that would provide the internet with services, kind of like one big garage sale for the entire world. The site grew so popular that even to this very day it's still used by millions of people. Despite its rather outdated look, there's no doubt it's still quite a useful alternative for those who want to find a cheaper deal, but of course everything like this comes with a potential downside. You don't have the security and safety of a website that you would find like Amazon, or even something of eBay's type of stature, because it's completely controlled by those on the site itself. There's complete anonymity, and it's fully up to the purchaser and the provider of how they want to exchange whatever they're selling. Now in this case, that leaves a whole open opportunity for a whole lot of absolute psychopaths to use something like this to their advantage, of doing quite disturbing things. In November 11, 2011, there was an ad on Craigslist which advertised a farm of which would pay you $300 a week just to take care of. All you would have to do is travel to Ohio, in one of the most rural areas of the entire state, and take care of the farm, of its basic needs, and you would not have to pay any money or rent. You would actually get paid for it. So of course this was a very alluring type of deal for anyone who would see it. Now of course, in this situation, we're dealing with Craigslist here. There's no direct way to know exactly who's offering anything and who's selling something. So someone by the name of Scott Davis had traveled to a rural farm off the advertisement that was listed on Craigslist. Now considering Craigslist is a central hotspot for good deals because Amazon is just too mainstream and safe, it wasn't an unnatural looking occurrence. Scott Davis was looking for a job for extra money, and he could not resist the allure of this offer since it was just so convenient and not even too far away. The lister went by the name of Jack, and on the advertisement it showed all the details, very cut and dry and to the point. Now Jack, of course. So far we're ticking 2 of these 3 note boxes, and the only other one would be if this all happened in 2008, but it didn't, so we're good when it comes to that. So Scott Davis travels out to the location that was determined by this ad to be Marietta, to meet up with the lister, going by the name of Jack, and his nephew at a diner. Now so far everything is looking good, nothing seems too awry. He meets with him, and he looks like a normal farmer, nothing out of the normal, and it's just a normal looking farming community type place. So this is the point where, afterwards, they meet up at the restaurant, and they both had a nice conversation about how easy it would be to take care of this farm, and how much of a good deal it would be to be paid for it. And he gets in the back of their car, and they go off to go see this farm for the first time. So they go off onto this rural long road, which is going straight to the farm. Now to re-emphasize how far out of the way this is from pretty much anywhere, this is in the middle of Ohio, most particularly near the city of Marietta. This is one of the most empty places in the whole half the country. Sometime along, he's told that there won't be any cell service when they get there. And as they keep going down this very singular road, getting farther and farther away from pretty much anything he can see, this proves to be the case. And this road keeps getting worse in quality and begins getting very far away from pretty much anything. Then Jack suddenly tells the driver, his nephew, to pull over because he wanted to get some hunting equipment that he left there. So he asks Scott to come with him and help find it. Now, Jack had said that he had captured a deer earlier and he just didn't pick up the trap that he had left behind. So still, to Scott Davis, nothing was really unusual feeling. He agrees and they go off into the woods after they park the car on the side of the road, and Scott doesn't see anything as they travel further and further into the brush. Now, these trees are very, very dense. This forest is very dark, as it's part of the country where very, very thick trees are not really too disturbed because there's not even really any civilization anywhere. But they go off even further as to find this hunting gear, which Jack was adamant that he had left behind in this area. And once Jack is behind him, to the point where Scott was actually the one who was leading the way, basically straight into the unknowns of this very dark forest, he doesn't see anything. But with Jack behind him, that's when he hears a click sound directly behind. At first he doesn't even know what it was, he was just confused. So he turns around with Jack behind him to see that there's Jack holding at point-blank range a very large handgun. So nothing was said. All Scott Davis could remember experiencing is just the type of expression that the supposed Jack had worn on his face in that one moment, on how his eyes were completely black and without any emotion. But in that 1 second before anyone could react, the gun was fired, and Scott takes off after being shot in the elbow. Luckily, he still has full ability of his legs, so he's able to run off directly into the trees further, and Jack chases him, constantly shooting. At this point, Jack is completely aware of the fact that this is not only not a normal person, not even a normal murderer, this is a complete psychopath. So as Scott makes it further into the wilderness, far away from where he was originally shot, he hears the car that he was just in start driving somewhere nearby, closing in on him from the distant road that he couldn't even see. So all Scott could do at this point is wander mindlessly through the woods, hoping that he doesn't somehow get ambushed by more people or even the original assailant. There's absolutely nothing out here. And the sun starts going down, to the point where now the dark forest is also even more dark on account of it being nearly night. So he's been stranded in the woods, and he gets to a random house finally, upon it being basically already pitch black. And he's in the middle of the wilderness, so he goes to their door and knocks, and it gets answered by a little kid, who completely isn't aware of the situation whatsoever. The only time any kind of help is actually reached is when the owner of the household realizes that this man has been shot, almost clean through the arm, and then calls the police.
911, what's your emergency?
We just had a gentleman come up to our front door. He claims he's been shot. He's got blood on him.
So it was upon this time that Scott Davis, luckily, was recovered and received the help that he needed, and he survived the entire encounter. But it was only the beginning of the farm in Ohio. This exact thing happened to at least one other person, from the sequence of the restaurant to the same lonely road. At this time, the Craigslist advertisement for the same location was still up and had been up for an undeterminable amount of time. Now, there's no Find My iPhone or Strava app in these days that can just easily find wherever this happened. And all Scott can do is just tell the authorities, who are now looking for the farm, that he had lost his hat upon being chased after he had been attacked. So, they took this information to go and look in the woods in this general proximity near the lone road, and what they find is a 6-foot rectangle hole in the ground, which looked like a hand-dug grave. Luckily not being filled this time. The investigation at this point would expand to the entire state of Ohio. Search dogs and all kinds of police teams would scour the entire half the state for more information on who exactly was involved with this crime and what other details they could find surrounding this whole situation. Only a day later, one of the police cruisers and a team of search dogs had found one of these hand-dug graves nearby, actually within only a couple hundred feet proximity of the last one. This time, it wasn't so fortunate, and a victim was found. Only a few hundred feet away from where Scott Davis had been attacked, someone was found in a shallow grave, and their identity had been completely stripped, and it seemed as if they had been robbed of even the small amount of possessions that they carried on them at the time. They found some items that were left behind and were able to identify them and track them back down to another person named David Bruce, who had gone missing a whole week earlier, right before the last thing being said from him being that he was going to go to a farm in Ohio after seeing an advertisement on Craigslist. So this is obviously no longer a small operation. It's caught the attention of the whole state of Ohio, and the entire country, for that matter, and that's saying something. So after the police locate these two graves, they find more disturbed areas in the same rural location, and find yet again another executed victim in another shallow grave, with the same methodical signs of attack. except this time being more brutal. So now this whole situation has uncovered 2 confirmed murders, all drawing back to one Craigslist profile, Jack. This is the point where they realize that there's really no other better solution other than to contact Craigslist and say, you know, you have to give us some info on this. This is mostly an anonymous ethos of a site, but Craigslist says, you know what, this is completely unfounded. Nothing like this has ever happened before, and here's the IP address to the account, which was responsible for hosting this advertisement to this farm in Ohio, and it leads the police directly to this specific house owned by another person. So they go all the way there, but they are adamant, the person who answered the door, that they have no idea what this is all about and have never even used the website, but curiously had been renting his whole basement to a man going by the name Dutch for several weeks straight. Now this homeowner reported that Dutch had used his own laptop, which explains the IP address being logged straight to that location. So after searching the basement and the whole house anyway, because this is such a big situation, they find, almost like clockwork, the belongings of this first victim that they had found in boxes just lying around in this guy's basement, along with a box of someone else's belongings that had yet not been connected to anyone, expensive items, and even personal IDs. As it turns out, this is yet the identity of the third victim. So at this point, it's clear that this Craigslist killer is assuming multiple fake identities, drawing in more vulnerable victims each time, but every time, they use the same restaurant that they would meet up in. This was the fatal flaw, because this is where law enforcement could then put the pieces together and go there to see the camera, and thusly finally find the exact moment where the original victim, Scott Davis, by his own testimony, and 2 other questionable figures standing around in that same diner. This is where they identified the guy, Jack, and that was, of course, not his real name. And it was confirmed by Scott when they showed him. The guy that they knew that they were seeing on the camera had a whole background of already breaking the law by posing as a fake pastor, and other things like making a fake halfway house and advertising it. So every time this guy would go to court, he would advertise this fake rehabilitation center so that the people committing minor crimes involved would be sent there, where he would then receive benefits, but instead of actually providing help, he would just sell them drugs. But this activity got him wanted on the highest of lists for all of these crimes, one after another. Not even talking about the Craigslist situation, this guy, who still went by the name of Jack, was already looking at going away for a very long time. So it became clear what the motive was here. From the information that they could find, they knew that who this person was actually Richard Beasley. And he was luring victims to this farm off of Craigslist with an advertisement to then kill them and assume their identity to continue getting away from the cops. And this scheme wouldn't even end after 2 murder victims were found. This is where they can draw their attention straight to this young person. They go to the school that the 16-year-old went to, and they ask for an interview, which they were granted. And this guy says, you know, I have nothing to do with this, I was just there, and I didn't see what happened. And this guy's just a friend of mine. But they go to his house, and they find boxes of these weapons, guns, tranquilizers, and basically, that was enough just to book it. There was enough evidence to suggest that not only was this guy involved with the crime, but if anything, was probably the main culprit. Richard Beasley was elevated to that of the conspirator, or the person planning the entire thing. But there's still nothing on where the main killer is. The only thing that progressed the investigation further was many weeks later, when a note arrived on the original house owner, of which the police were originally drawn to, on their door, which had supposedly been written by Dutch, who hadn't been seen by this homeowner for a very long time. But he had left his phone number, saying that he knew that the cops had shown up there, and that he wanted them to give him a call. This, of course, predictably proved to not be the smartest move when an entire state of police were already after you, because the cops immediately could use this exact phone number to triangulate the location of this guy, of where they then tracked him down, where they found him to be casually walking down the street one day. And walking down the street, there was Richard Beasley, and as he was arrested, he proclaimed that he had no idea what was going on. He acted just as innocent as you could possibly imagine some random person who would have been confronted by a whole squadron of police to be. But it was quite obvious that there was more to this whole thing than what was to be believed. After all of these months of gathering evidence, and after every single thing and testimony that they had received, they had not one, but now 2 suspects in this whole crime. The 16-year-old, who still completely refused to cooperate by any means, and now the perpetrator, who had gone by multiple different names, and was obviously the main person who had hosted this ad on Craigslist. the original Jack. Now, throughout the entire process of interviewing and interrogations and processing to the point where they would get to court, Richard Beasley had proclaimed that he was completely innocent. And it didn't really help the case that the 16-year-old who was obviously involved, not even taking a plea deal to allow himself to receive less jail time, considering that it was quite inevitable due to all of the evidence that they had against them. It became quite apparent that Richard Beasley had recruited the 16-year-old into his own cult. And in this cult, the doctrine stated that all these victims were referred to as candidates, and it was clear that over a very long period of time, he had taught the 16-year-old all these different things and all these different interpretations of the Bible even, considering that the 16-year-old had also been a frequent churchgoer and believed to some extent that what they were doing was actually excommunicating people from the earth who didn't deserve to be alive. Even though they were not able to get anything out of the main suspect, the 16-year-old was able to reveal yet another victim, a fourth one, who was killed over a simple $5 worth of change. In excruciating detail, more information was shared on exactly how they did it and where exactly it was. This is where they confirmed by finding yet the fourth buried body in the ground. So now we have 4 different crimes, 1 attempted murder, all drawing back to just a simple Craigslist advertisement. Entire self-made cult being run by at least 2 people. So it came to the point where Richard Beasley was being sentenced, because this was irrefutable evidence, and there was just absolutely no doubt that he was the one responsible for all of this.
And at that point, he had picked a wide spot in the road, and he let Scott and I out, and he went down the hill to turn around and come back.
You mean Rogan did?
Rogan did. He was driving the car, yes.
So he drove the car down to turn the car around?
To turn the car around.
Right. And you and Scott Davis did what?
Scott Davis then pulled out a revolver and pointed it at my head. And I threw my hands up and about urinated in my pants. And I just said, "Why?" And he explained why. He said, "Brother, you're a weak link."
Stuck a gun at the back of his head, just as you done with Scott
Absolutely
Davis,
not.
pulled the trigger,
Wrong.
and shot him in the back of the head.
You're a liar. I did not do that. And you didn't see it. Nobody testified to that in this court. It did not happen.
So Scott Davis was being untruthful about that, correct?
Absolutely, positively, he lied through his teeth.
With regard to count 1 of the indictment, aggravated murder regarding the death of Ralph Geiger, this jury, we the jury being duly impaneled and sworn, do hereby find that the aggravating circumstances that the defendant was found guilty of committing do outweigh the mitigating factors presented in this case by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. We therefore unanimously find that the sentence of death should be imposed on Richard James Beasley.
It was because of all this that Richard would be sentenced to death, and to this very day would remain in prison until that would take place, whereas the 16-year-old he had recruited had received a life sentence due to not taking a plea deal, leaving this whole situation still very unsatisfying despite being solved. And there's really only just one main takeaway from all of this. Don't go to Ohio. So that was the horrifying story of Craigslist War Serial Killer. Now, many have acclaimed the title of the Craigslist serial killer over the years, mainly because of the nature of Craigslist. Now, I wouldn't say Craigslist is by nature a dangerous site. However, because of the way it simply is, it can facilitate very suspect type behavior. Overall, the only thing I could recommend for you personally is to stay safe with your own endeavors on the internet, and just to use your own common sense and intuition. So I hope this story was interesting to you and doesn't give you too bad of nightmares tonight. But thanks for watching, and as always, you'll see me in the next one.